I'm very happy to host yet another Q&A session on line with another very interesting and very lively evening of FestivalYA. Very, very briefly, I'm just going to tell you a couple of things, essential things that you should know about our author tonight, that in case you haven't grabbed her book yet. So tonight we're going to be here online with M.L.Rio. She's a very special author with a very nice story as far as I could grasp so far, who wrote a very special book as well. Besides finding it in the original language, so in English by cartu.xyz, which is the main organizer of this lovely event, you can also find it in the Romanian translation at Alice Books. And we also have some of the representatives of the publishing house here with us. Hi. So you can also read it in Romanian if you haven't had the chance so far. And yes, just like my colleague is mentioning right now in the chat, we would really, really love to see you guys as well. So if you have the possibility, kindly turn your cameras on, or at least when you decide to address our guest tonight, it would be nice for us to be able to also see you. That was it so far. So I'm just going to start this evening with a very quick round of warm-up questions till you get the courage to also ask stuff. And I will just briefly explain the procedure. So when you want to ask something, you have a couple of options. Option one, and if you have the camera on, just raise your hand like this, boom, raise hand so that I can see you. Option number two, especially if you don't have a camera on, but also if you have it because it's easier to follow, use the option on the lower part of your Zoom app. There is reactions over there. Click on it and you have a raise hand thingy, which you can click, and then I will see that you raise your hand. Option number three, ask your question or say whatever you want to say to the author in the chat, and I will check it up and I will voice the questions for you. There is also the possibility of asking questions as comments on Facebook or YouTube, which my lovely colleagues from cartu.xyz will take and put on chat so that I can voice them to the author as well. That being said, I managed to make the introduction in 3 minutes. I'm very proud of myself. Thank you very much. Wow, exciting. Dear author, welcome. We are very happy to have you here. And I'm very curious to ask you about these very interesting career switches that you had, and this very somehow tortuous path that you followed. So if you can be so kind and tell us a bit of your life story before we dig into the writing part.
Oh gosh, sure. So writing has always been a big part of my life, and it's kind of one of the few through lines of my life. I was a very avid reader from a very young age. And I started writing at a very young age as well. I think I wrote my first novel, going to put that in quotes because I don't know if it really qualifies as a novel because I was so young. Wrote my first novel when I was 12 and just kind of kept doing that. And fortunately, I recognized that none of it was publishable at that point. So all of those novels just kind of lived in a drawer. But I think that's a really necessary part of the process to kind of learn how to write and learn your own voice as a writer, is to write a bunch of stuff that no one's ever going to see. So I did that for a bunch of years. And at the same time, I was also very deeply involved in the theater. I was an actor starting at about age 6 or 7 in community theater, and got very intensely into regional and professional theater by the time I was about 9 or 10. And then I did my first Shakespeare play when I was 14. I played Este in Twelfth Night. And after that, it was kind of all I really wanted to do anymore, was to do Shakespeare on stage in front of people. So that was really what I pursued for the next, like, oh God, like 8 years, all the way through college. And in college, I was a double major. I double majored in English and theater with a minor in creative writing. So just sort of doing it all at once. And I was also on the producing board for a couple of different theater companies in high school and college. So in addition to being an actor, I was also working behind the scenes. I was a director. I was a dramaturg. I was a tech person. I was actually the undergrad carpenter at my university for a couple of years, and I was a certified welder at one point. So very flash dance. But when I was a senior in college, I was working on my thesis, which was, I was smashing together all 3 parts of Henry VI, with the idea that you could perform it in the same amount of time with the same amount of resources as like any other standalone Shakespeare history. And so we actually also put this play on once I finished the adaptation. We had 10 actors playing 77 parts, including me, by the way. I was one of the actors, in the outdoor theater in the woods behind our university campus. And on our opening weekend, it actually poured down rain, so we had to make the first 3 rows into like a splash zone. But that's kind of a long way of saying that when I was working on this, I got very interested in the idea of Shakespearean structure, like how Shakespeare structures a play, and particularly the tragedies, but also the histories, because I was working on the histories, but the histories tend to kind of follow a tragic pattern because history is very rarely comedic in the long view of things. And so I had written all these novels kind of in the background, and none of them were particularly good, and I couldn't figure out why. And then when I was working on my thesis, I kind of went, wait a minute, like, why haven't you written about this? You've been a Shakespearean actor for all these years. You've been immersed in this really weird, deeply culty environment for such a long time. And write what you know is hackneyed but good advice. There's a certain kind of like authenticity that you can't fake as a writer. And that authenticity is also really seductive for a reader. It's really marvelous to listen to a writer write about something they really know and really know well. So I started writing villains my senior year of college. I was 22, and then I took a gap year. I had 4 jobs, and I lived in a storage unit. One of my jobs was I worked at Barnes & Noble, so I worked as a bookseller while I was writing villains. I also worked for a couple of theater companies and in a wine bar, gig economy. And then I applied to graduate school, and I sold my book at about the same time that I was accepted to a couple of graduate programs. So I moved to London to get my master's degree in Shakespeare studies while I was revising the book for publication. So I got my master's at King's College in the Globe, which was really cool. I got to work at Shakespeare's Globe for a couple of years. And then I came back to the States and took another kind of gap year to launch the book here in 2017. And then nothing happened. The book came out, and then it very quickly disappeared. Nobody really read it. It got a couple of good reviews, but the sales just really weren't there. And I think my publisher kind of wrote it off as a lost cause. And, one of the dirty secrets of the publishing industry is that most books fail. Most books fail, most books don't earn out, and most people who publish a book never publish again. It's something like 90% of people who publish a book never publish again. So I sort of assumed that that was what was going to happen to me. I kind of went, okay, well, I tried it and it didn't work, so what now? And because I hate myself, I decided to go back to graduate school and do my PhD in Shakespeare, which Shakespeare studies, and a couple of other kind of niche subfields. And that took 6 years of my life. And so I just defended my dissertation in February. So I'm officially done with my PhD now. And in the middle of all that, in the middle of the pandemic, my agent and I started to see the numbers for villains kind of do this, and really didn't know why. But it seems to have kind of found an audience, 7 or 8 years after the fact. And we're just really grateful to be on this very strange journey. So that was a very long story, but yeah, that's how I got here.
No, it's perfect. I think it was just a perfect beginning, just to warm things up, as I was saying. But I'm just gonna grab a bit of what you just said about your PhD and about your niche, as you call them, research topics, because I read something about mental disorders or something about fatigue and something about, I don't know. So maybe you'd like to explain a bit, because I think it's very important, especially for people who have read the book, because I think that there's a lot of what you studied and what you researched that can be also found in the pages of the book. And for those who haven't read the book, maybe it will be something like, this is something that you can somehow find in the book, if it makes sense at all.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's going to be a lot of academic jargon in here because there's just no way around it. But so my doctorate dissertation, my research as an academic, I look at representations of madness and mental disorder in the early modern period on stage. So my research kind of combines history of theater and performance practice. So how are these plays actually performed in the 1600s? Because I mostly look at that the turn of the 17th century. And so that's one part of it. And then the other part of it is looking at medical history. So reading a lot of doctors' notebooks from the 1600s and sort of unpicking what early modern understandings of madness and mental disorder are, how those kind of manifest on stage, and what I think the playwrights are kind of doing with that. What are they saying about madness? And I'm putting that in air quotes because that's obviously not what we would call it now. But in the 16th, 17th century, it was madness covered a lot of things that we would now, have more precise diagnostic terms for. So that's basically what I look at, is the history of mental disorder and where that comes up in principally Shakespeare's plays, but I do look at a lot of other playwrights as well.
Hello, Shakespeare should have plenty of it as well.
Yeah, interestingly, Shakespeare actually, part of the reason Shakespeare is the focus of my dissertation is he depicts some form of mental disorder in like 30% of his plays in all genres. And all of the early modern playwrights are very interested in this notion of madness. And that's kind of endemic to theater writ large, like going back to the Greeks, who were very important to the early modern playwrights. Dionysus is the god of madness. He's also the god of theater. Those two things are very, very enmeshed over time. But Shakespeare depicts more madness than any other early modern playwright. And there's something very interesting to me about that.
Yeah, actually, to be honest, I have to confess that I was like, somehow I was giving him up, because that it's like, classic, and I was looking maybe for some modern reinterpretations or something. But after reading your book, I thought like, there are a couple of plays that actually I'd like to reread, maybe having this in mind somehow. So thank you for, rekindling somehow my relationship with Shakespeare, if that makes sense.
No, that makes total sense. And that's my favorite thing to hear as a writer, is that people have read this book and now want to go read Shakespeare. That's like catnip for me. I love that. So yeah.
Great. Whew. Point for me. Guys, okay, so guys and girls and everyone else, now is the right time for you to maybe get the guts to start asking our lovely author your own questions. So remember the procedure, it's quite easy. Either you raise a hand so that I can see you, or you use the thingy, the emoticon that you have with the raise hand, so that I can see the order in which you do it, or just start typing very, very fast in the chat room so that I can voice your questions. And this would be a very, very good moment to start. I don't see any hands. I'm confused. I see one hand. Do I see more? 2 hands, 3 hands. Okay, let's start like this. So we're going to have Thea, then Theodora, and then Alessia. Please go on.
Can you all hear me? I'm not sure. Okay. Yeah. Hi, I'm so happy to see you. And I love your book so much.
Oh, thank you.
It's just amazing because somehow you put all of my interests in one book. So I don't know how you did that, but it's amazing. My question was, starting from the fact that If We Were Villains is all about Shakespeare and stage plays, is there any way that you could see an adaptation of it as a stage play?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. And I'm actually not sure what the rights are around that. I would have to go back and look at my contract and see if we've retained the rights for a stage adaptation. So from the legal side, I actually don't know. But from the kind of practical side, I would be really curious to see someone try and put it on stage. I don't know how it would work because there's so much that would be kind of difficult to stage. But, the theater, one of the things I love about it is so inventive that there's always a way to do something. And that was kind of what I loved about doing tech theater specifically, is when you're building a set for something that requires all kinds of fantastic elements, that script doesn't come with an instruction manual for how to do that. You have to just kind of figure it out. Like I'm thinking of, I don't even remember what the play was, but we were working on a show where it had to snow continuously for like 5 minutes in a scene, and snow machines don't do that. They just kind of like shoot out a puff of snow, and it's not super realistic. So what we ended up doing was getting a big giant PVC pipe like the size of a log, drilling a bunch of holes in it, and then putting it on like a rotator and sticking it up in the catwalk. So we had 2 people up there like doing this for like 5 minutes, and the snow was sort of falling out slowly. So that's just kind of one example of, there's always a way to make theatrical magic happen if you have enough creative minds in a room. So yeah, I mean, this book is all about theater, and I would love to kind of see the plays within the story become plays within the play, because that's a very Shakespearean thing. So yeah, I would be very eager to see that.
I would definitely love to see it as well. And I hope I can see it one day, maybe even star in it one day. I love to tell my, theater friends, let's do it.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Thank you so much.
For sure.
Thank you, Thea. We now have Teodora and then Alessia.
Yeah, hi. I actually read your book like 3 times, and I read it after I read The Secret History. And I saw a lot of parallels between the books, and I was curious if maybe you took your inspiration or part of it from The Secret History.
So I get that question a lot too, and it's partly because my publisher pushed that comparison really, really hard. And the reason for that is not so much that The Secret History was my source of inspiration, but just because it's kind of the most successful book in this genre. And dark academia didn't exist when I was writing this book. Like, you could not buy a dark academia themed candle on Instagram in the year of our Lord 2014. But because The Secret History has kind of dominated that genre for so long, there is this sort of misconception that it's like the only book in that genre, which it's not. It's also not the first book in that genre. So I did read The Secret History, but I only actually read it once. And there's a bunch of other books that I read that were really more influential for me. I read John Knowles's A Separate Piece when I was like 11, and that was the first book that like really upset me. And then I reread it every year for like 5 years. I'm also thinking of like Eleanor Catton's book, The Rehearsal, and even Gentlemen and Players, Dead Poet Society, which is a movie and not a book. But this is a much longer tradition than a lot of people get the impression of. And, I did read The Secret History, and there were things I liked about it, but there were also things about it that I found really frustrating, which are frustrating, I think, kind of, or at the time, were frustrating kind of in the campus novel genre writ large. One of them is that it's always such a sausage fest. It's always such a boys' club. There's always like one female character, and her only role is for the boys to fight over her. And I was like, okay, can we not imagine an academic environment where there are women who actually have roles to play? So that was one thing that I kind of wanted to correct in my version of the genre. Another thing was the representation of queer people. There's so much queer baiting in early campus novels, and I really didn't want to do that. I wanted queer characters to be kind of at the forefront, and that to be something that was kind of celebrated by the text instead of sort of hinted at and then pushed under the rug. So I did read The Secret History, but it's not my favorite campus novel. I have nothing against it really, but it's less of an influence than people tend to think.
Yes, thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you, Thea. It's Alessia's turn.
Hello, I'm very happy to have the point to meet you. My question is, how did you come up with the idea for the before villains?
Great. Yeah. So I started writing villains, like I said, when I was working on my senior honors thesis, when I was a senior in college. And it kind of came from that place of like, this is a world that I know really well, and why have I never written about this? But the way it really came to be was I was so interested at that time in Shakespearean structure and how he puts plays together. And I kind of wanted to do two things with this book. One was I wanted to see if I could kind of build my own Shakespearean tragedy. I didn't want to do a retelling of any one Shakespeare play, because that's been done 1,000 times and I didn't want to do that again. And also, like, if you wanted to just go read Macbeth, like, just go read Macbeth. I'm not going to do that better than Shakespeare did. So instead, I kind of wanted to beg, borrow, and steal elements from all these different plays and sort of cobble them together into something new. So that was one part of it, and kind of where the plot comes from. But the other part of it, which was equally important, was the characters. It's a very character-driven story, and Oliver's the narrator, but I wouldn't necessarily say he's the main character. He is one of the main characters. So the other part of it was me going, all right, if you walked into a room where a Shakespearean troupe was rehearsing, what are the personality types you would inevitably encounter in that space? And I had been in many Shakespearean theater troupes at that point, so I had interacted with a lot of these different people, and I'd been a lot of these different people. And that was a world that I just wanted to represent because I had never really seen it in fiction from behind the curtain before.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for the questions. Thanks for the answers. I'm going to take two from the chat right now because I just promised. So first, just to make sure that we're in chronological order as well, I'm going to take Anna Maria's. So she says, congrats on all the hard work. So glad to be here. Would like to ask, were the characters in the book based on real people in your life?
That's another question I get a lot. And what I would say is none of them are based on individual people. Like, none of them are based on individual people I knew. Instead, they were based on like types of people I had known and worked with. So yes and no. Nobody's based on an individual human. Like, these are not avatars for my friends in college or my teachers. They're sort of kind of like drawn from many different people I've known in the course of my life, and they're their own people as well, kind of going off different personality types and how they mix or how they don't, and the personality types that you kind of find in that sort of theater space. But the book is also very much about how, as an actor and as humans more broadly, we often get sort of assigned a role to play, but that sort of can never really encompass how complicated real people actually are. So part of the book is also about deconstructing those kind of tropes and types.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you as well. And we're going to take Clara's first question now. She says the book's ending was particularly powerful and emotionally resonant. How did you decide on the ending, and what do you hope readers take from it?
How did I decide on the ending? It doesn't feel like something I decided on. It just felt like the way it had to end. And I don't know how to explain it better than that. It was just sort of the story that I had constructed and what it was building toward. That just seemed like the only possible ending that I could see. And that's partly because of the Shakespearean structure I was working with, but also just kind of the emotional arc of the story and what it was kind of logically building towards. So it was the only ending I ever considered. And I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question? Oh, what do I want readers to take away from it? Yeah, there's a couple of different reactions to the ending. Some people really love it and some people really hate it. No one's ever lukewarm on this ending. But what I would want readers to take away from it, and this is maybe also why it ends the way it does, one of the things that I really love about Shakespeare is sometimes the things he doesn't tell you are as important and as interesting as the things he does tell you. He leaves a lot of blank spaces and a lot of gaps that are sometimes really important. Maybe the most obvious one is Lady Macbeth's absent child. She mentions in like 2 lines a baby that she had that no longer seems to exist. And Shakespeare never answers our questions about, well, whose baby is it? Is it Macbeth's baby? Is it her baby from a former marriage? Like, what happened to this child? Did the child die? That happened frequently with children in the early modern period. We don't know. We don't know what happened to that child, and we don't know what the impact of that absent child is. And that makes for such a rich experience, not only as a reader, but also as an actor and a director, because you have to make a decision about how you fill in that backstory. So that's kind of what I hope readers will do with the blank spaces in villains. There's a lot of deliberate ambiguity, and not just kind of the big ending question, but there's a lot of questions that are sort of left open. And my hope is that readers will kind of think back through the story and decide for themselves what they think those answers are and where they think the story goes from here, because that's a more active reading experience as opposed to just a passive reading experience. I really want you to feel like you're involved in the narrative. So maybe that's why it ends the way it does.
Thank you so much for this. I'm gonna take Antonia's questions. No, I'm sorry. I promised Alice first and then Antonia. So Alice.
Yes, hi.
Hi.
I really, really loved your book. I am a former literature student, so I am very familiar with Shakespeare. And I think you've done a great job in incorporating Shakespeare and everything that he stands for. Every single thing I found is in the book, and I really enjoyed it because of that. And I could talk about this forever, but I will not talk about it forever. I will just ask a question that has been on my mind ever since I have finished the book, is if you have encountered any publishing challenges because you have used Shakespeare and you have used part of his plays. So I was just wondering, were there any difficulties? And yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Just to clarify, do you mean like legal publishing difficulties, or more like
mostly
copyright, right? You mean copyright?
Yes,
thing,
mostly that.
Yeah, no, not at all, because Shakespeare's in the public domain, because it was all written and published literally hundreds of years ago. That's fair game. So yeah, no legal issues with the Shakespeare. Nope. Although I will say, I think there may have been some complications with translated editions of the books, because depending on the territory, some of them were using existing translations of Shakespeare to kind of incorporate that. If their translator wasn't comfortable with that. None of that came to me though. That was all stuff that the individual publishers had to work out. As far as my draft of the book, it's no problem, because that's the beauty of things that existed before copyright, is you don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, I totally agree on that one. Thank you, Alice, for your question. Now I'm going to take Antonia's. Sorry for the confusion. Antonia's question seems to have a lot of fans already in the chat, so I'm going to voice it. You've mentioned in your 5-year edition book that there were certain things you would have changed. Could you mention one such thing?
Oh, sure. I mean, so part of the really strange trajectory of this novel is that I wrote it when I was 22 and I'm now 31. And it is very strange to look back on work that you did 8 or 9 years ago. It's the analogy that I usually use is it's kind of like looking at pictures of yourself from high school. It's like an equal part nostalgia and deep bodily horror about oh my God, who let you cut your hair like that? Who let you go out of the house wearing that shirt? But also, some kind of fondness for your younger self. So I have really honestly mixed feelings about the text, just because it is such a snapshot of who I was a long time ago, and people change a lot in 10 years. So in terms of what would I have changed? Honestly, I would have changed everything, just because I'm a different person now. But I also don't think I could have written this book at age 31, because so much of it is about being in your early 20s and that kind of liminal space between youth and adulthood, where you're technically old enough to be legally responsible for your actions, but you're also still young enough to be making really stupid mistakes. And that's, I think it would be hard to kind of live in that space as a writer if you were not of that same age. I also didn't see a lot of books written for people that age. YA was kind of booming at the time. There was a lot of YA, and there wasn't a lot in the middle. And then it was a bunch of books about like middle-aged people getting divorced. And I was like, can we have like something to kind of bridge this gap? So would I change everything now? Yes, but could I have written this book now? I don't think so. On a more kind of practical level, the original draft of this book was like 120,000 words, and my publisher said it needs to be 110. So you need to find a way to cut 10,000 words while also adding a bunch of stuff. That's the impossible math problem of revision. So there were some things that got left on the cutting room floor that I was sad to lose. And I think the biggest one for me is Ren got kind of short shrift at the end. Like, things had to get cut, and there was like so much more I had to say and wanted to say about her, and it was just like not the thing that my editor deemed the most important to kind of make the narrative hang together. So yeah, if I could only change one thing, I really wish that Ren had gotten a little more page space, especially in the second half.
Totally agree on that one. Maybe you'll write a sequel or something with her. She was one of my favorite characters, but yeah. Don't mind me. I'm fine. Okay, back to the questions. So Maria Ivana, you are next.
Yes, hello, it's so nice to meet you. I actually finished the book this week, and yes, and well, obviously James and Oliver's relationship is a very complicated, complex one. And I wanted to ask you, at what point when actually writing the book did you realize that you wanted to give them that ending? And why exactly did you choose that specific ending for them?
So I'm a very thorough planner. I have a hard time starting in on actually writing prose unless I know where the story is going. So I knew exactly what that trajectory was from the beginning of my writing process. And kind of like I mentioned a minute ago about the ending, that was the only ending that ever really seemed possible to me. And I think Oliver actually sums it up fairly well in that epilogue when he talks about all the kind of extremities of feelings they put each other through, not just this really intense devotion that is sometimes kind of, sometimes it's platonic and it's often very much not. And it takes Oliver a really long time to figure that out. But, they also kind of torture each other in a somewhat unintentional, but not always unintentional kind of a way. And I think to give them a less complicated and more happier resolution would have felt very dishonest to the trajectory of the book and their relationship through it. It is very complicated and it is very difficult. And that's true of all the characters in the book, not just James and Oliver. And that, I think, is really kind of essential to Shakespeare and to this genre, is that human dynamics are messy. And especially when you put a bunch of people in a really high pressure, really competitive environment where they are bonding, but they're also constantly butting heads because they're in competition with each other. So yeah, I wanted an ending that felt honest to a relationship with that many kind of emotional gradations, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thanks for the question. Thanks for the answers. I'm going to take 3 questions from the chat now and then 1 live question. So I will start with Clara again. What songs do you associate with If We Were Villains?
Ooh, oh, goodness. So of the many hats that I wear, I'm also a music writer. I work for a music magazine called The Vinyl District. I am a very avid record collector, which is coming back to bite me now that I'm trying to move and I have 1,000 records in my living room that I have to figure out what to do with. So music is a huge part of my writing process, and there was so much music I listened to while working on villains that picking a couple of songs would be really hard. What I might tell you, and I can drop a link to this in the chat later, is so I did a Reddit AMA last week or the week before where somebody asked me a question about like what's in the music that you listen to or that you associate with these characters, and I listed a bunch of albums that were kind of key to me while I was working on it. So I might send you there, and I will find that link for you. But also, if you go on my website or any of my socials, you can find that Reddit AMA where there's a much longer answer to that.
Thank you. I also dropped right now in the chat a link to where you publish your
Oh,
music features.
great.
So
Yeah.
people, if you're curious about this and about what she covers on music, then you can check it out.
Yeah.
I'm going to take Denisa now with, do you feel that the dark academia status of if we were villains is put under, okay, so it's oversaturating its content. So maybe it's like overwhelming.
Oh, yeah. So I have a weird relationship to this genre because when I wrote this book, this subgenre like didn't really exist. Because, you know, I wrote this book 8 or 9 years ago now, and dark academia didn't really take off until like the middle of the pandemic, and a lot of it I think had to do with TikTok. Although I'm not on TikTok, I've never had a TikTok. I don't know anything about it, so you guys probably have a better sense of that than I do. As far as oversaturation, you know, I think it's kind of a yes and no question. I think it's a little from column A and a little from column B, because, you know, like nobody asks, is the mystery genre oversaturated? There are a million novels out there in the mystery genre, and you have subgenres that kind of proliferate. I think what's happening right now is there is a boom in this genre for a couple of reasons. And one of those reasons, I think, is I was sort of weirdly early getting into this. I think a lot of people now are just sort of people who are wildly overeducated, especially in the United States, and very jaded about their education, are coming of age to write these novels right about now, because most people don't publish in their 20s. Most people publish in their 30s and older. But, you know, you're right. I do think that we're kind of reaching a point of critical mass with this genre where, you know, there are only so many readers for a genre that kind of specific. And I think that eventually the kind of meteoric rise that it's had will die down. But I also think that there's room for sort of infinite variation in any genre. So it'll be interesting to see how the genre shifts and changes and becomes more diverse and becomes more varied as more people kind of get into it and do different things with it. So I think it'll kind of grow and change once people get tired of reading the same sort of tropes.
I will just insert myself in this conversation of yours just for half a minute to say that I was quite surprised to see so many dark academia references, because this book was nothing as dark academia. I mean, it was just like so raw and so emotional and so about certain people that I also know that are in this industry, and, you know, they are generally the somehow weirdos or marginalized people, or people that people are like, you know, staring at. And I was like, you know, I could actually picture some of the actors I know in the roles. Like it was so raw and it was so natural that for me it was like, oh, where's darkness in this? Okay, so there is darkness, obviously. But, you know, I mean, just the normal day-to-day sort of life and the normal day-to-day sort of challenges that they face. That was like, and for me, it just came as a surprise that so many people consider it to be dark academia. It does make sense at a certain level if you define the genre as such. But on the other hand, I don't know, maybe it's just a personal opinion, but for me, it was like, oh, okay, just actors being actors, you know?
Yeah. And the thing is, like, you know, I did not write this consciously participating in that genre, because again, it didn't really exist. Like, campus novels were a thing. But for me, the motivating thing really was the Shakespeare. And I was thinking about what kind of an environment would you have this sort of a community under a microscope? And I think that really, you know, come for the dark academia, stay for the Shakespeare is kind of the place that Villains is in now, which, you know, I've been very lucky to kind of benefit from the popularity of this subgenre. But I do think that in terms of, you know, what sets Villains apart from anything else in the genre, and especially more recent novels that are kind of consciously participating in that genre, and this is not meant to be a dig at all, is the Shakespeare. Because, you know, you guys actually probably know more about the dark academia genre than I do, because I haven't read much of it in the last 7 years. because I've been off doing like actual academia, which doesn't leave a lot of time for reading novels, unfortunately. But yeah, the Shakespeare for me really is kind of the raison d'etre for this book. And that is the thing that I think kind of makes it unique in this, what is becoming a quite popular genre.
I really like this part of come for dark academia and stay for the Shakespeare.
Yeah,
I'm going to quote you on that one.
Yeah, I like that. Well, kind of that could be a good log line.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we're going to take a question from Ilinka live right now.
Hi. So I loved your book a lot. It's one of my favorites. And
Thank
what
you.
I liked most about it was the writing. I felt like it was so mesmerizing, and it really stuck with me. Is the type of writing that I think about late at night, and that really just you think about, I think, forever. And I wanted to ask you, apart from Shakespeare, what other type of like authors or books did you get like the writing style influence, not like the plot?
Oh, yeah, that's a tough question. You know, I was never consciously imitating any one writer or any sort of set of writers. But, you know, I think to be a good writer of any variety, you have to read constantly and you have to read widely. And I read a little bit of everything, and this has been true, and that's such a cliche to say, but it's true. I have favorites, of course. And, you know, there were certain authors that I was definitely thinking about more as I was writing villains. One of them actually is Iris Murdoch, who was a British author, largely active in the 20th century. And I think what I like so much about her writing is that in addition to being a fiction writer, she was also a theater person, and she was also an academic. She was a philosopher. She was a theologian. So her work is always very, very dense, but it is sort of richly intertextual. You know, her books are always in conversation with other works of literature and other forms of art. And that is something that really appeals to me, is thinking about how do you represent something like theater in prose? That's really hard to do. And, you know, also when I wear my music reviewer hat, that's one of my favorite things, is how do you render what a song sounds like in words? That's a really fun, delicious challenge. And it's kind of, that's really informed all of my writing, is trying to create something that is multisensory, even though it's just words on a page. I want you to be able to feel it and hear it and see it and smell it. So I tend to gravitate towards authors who I feel like have a really strong kind of immersive sense of fiction where you really feel like you're in it. But the other thing that has always been really important to me as a writer is dialogue. I love dialogue. It's one of the few things that, like, you know, as a writer, it's good to know what you're good at and good to know what you're not good at. And I think one of my strengths as a writer is dialogue. It's one of my favorite things to write. And so many of my favorite authors who have remained my favorite authors are the ones who write really snappy dialogue. Kurt Vonnegut is a favorite of mine, which is like so far removed from villains, but such an incredible way with dialogue and characters as well. So really just kind of all over the board. I think when you're finding your own voice as a writer, you have to kind of read a little bit of everything. Otherwise, you run the risk of sounding too much like someone else and not like yourself, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Ilinka, do you have any more questions or comments?
I wanted to say thank you and ask if you have any writing tips for people who like classics and who read classics a lot and who want to start writing their own novel based on a classic author or a certain book.
Sure. You know, I think it might actually be wary of the thing I was just talking about. Like, you definitely, especially if you're engaging consciously with another writer and with classics, you also want your voice to come through, not just the voice of that other text. So making sure that that's not the only thing that you're reading, reading other authors, reading other classics in the same genre or written at the same time, so that you have sort of a wider perspective, so that it's not too narrow. The other thing I would say is start reading some nonfiction. Nobody ever wants to do that because it feels like dry and dense and boring, but really it's not. Find some nonfiction, like read biographies of the writers that you're interested in engaging with. Read some academic material if you can, because getting a sense for the world that your author, your chosen author, or your chosen piece of work, whatever it is, the world that it came from and the culture that produced it, that's going to give you a little bit more of that authenticity that is so difficult to fake, that really, really knowing where you're coming from when you interact with that piece of media. Does that make sense? That was a kind of rambling answer.
It does make sense. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. And now we're going back to the book because we have one question in the chat that says like this from Lavinia. Congrats on the book. How do you see Oliver as a character and narrator? I've seen different opinions, and I personally think that the fact that he's an actor influenced his perspective on the story. I'm curious how you, as the author, see this.
Yeah, I mean, Oliver's identity as an actor is so inseparable from who he is as a person that, you know, that is absolutely how he interacts with the world. And this was a conversation I had with my editor really early on. So big chunks of the book are actually formatted like a stage play. They're written like a script. And that was kind of a hard sell. My editor was like, I don't know if people reading a novel are going to go for this. This might be kind of jarring and weird. And there were two reasons I did that. And one reason was really boring and practical, which is that when you have 7 main characters, it's a lot easier to write some of their dialogue as a script instead of going, he said, she said, he said, she said, he said, she said, until everyone like wants to fall down. And because they're actors, they spend a lot of time on stage. That's the easiest way to write a script. But the other part of it that was really more important, and this is why I stuck to my guns on that and really insisted on it, was Oliver's telling the story. He's an actor. That's how he would tell the story. That's how he interprets everything. He sees it like an actor. So he remembers it as a kind of script unfolding. So his role as an actor absolutely influences that. The other thing that I would say about Oliver as a narrator, a lot of people ask me if Oliver is a quote unquote unreliable narrator. And my counter to that is, I think an unreliable narrator is deliberately dishonest with the reader. Like an unreliable narrator is misleading the reader on purpose. Oliver's not that. Oliver's not unreliable. What he is obtuse. Oliver is about as observant as a brick wall. It takes him a very long time to catch on to things that are very obvious to other people in the book. So Oliver is sometimes missing things that are really important just because he's a little bit clueless. So as a narrator, if he's leaving important things out, it's not because he's doing it on purpose. It's because he's literally not seeing them, even when they are right in front of his face. So that was kind of essential to his role as a narrator. And I hope that sort of answers your question as well.
Thank you for this. And just for the sake of continuity, I'm going to skip to a question that is out of the line, but then I promise I'm going back to the next. So if I can just find it in the chat. Right. So it's another one from Thea. If I'm allowed another question, what other character do you feel was fitting as the narrator?
Oh, you know, Oliver has a line at one point in the book where he says it could have been any one of us. And I think that's also true of, well, with one kind of glaring exception, because he's only in half the book. I think any of these characters could have narrated it. What I will say is part of me really wants to see this book from Philippa's perspective, but also if Philippa were the narrator of this book, it would have been over in like 3 pages because she would have been having none of this nonsense at all. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like Philippa's version of the story would have been probably the most entertaining. Maybe Alexander for parts of it. You know, in the process of writing this, like I did the first draft very much thinking about Oliver's perspective. And then in subsequent drafts, I kind of went, okay, what's this person thinking in this scene? Like we get Oliver's perspective on it, but in subsequent drafts, I kind of went through and tried to put myself in Meredith's head for the whole book. And what is she thinking in those moments? And Oliver kind of observing little bits and pieces of that, like how people are reacting to different things. And if you go back and read the book, kind of knowing what happens, it changes all those early interactions because you realize who knows what at what point in the story. And that might influence the way you read very small moments.
Yeah, I actually think that the book with Meredith as a narrator would also be interesting. I mean, I
Yeah.
think it's a bit of a cliche, but when you come to dig, I don't think that Meredith is that much of a cliche as she seems to seem at the very first sight.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's her whole character arc. That's her
Yeah.
whole character arc is
Yeah.
she and everyone around her are kind of learning that she's more complicated than the role she's been cast in.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Right. Okay, a question from Facebook now. After the success of If We Were Villains, I think everyone is curious if you are working on anything new. We would love to get more of your writing.
Yeah, I would too. So what I'll say is, the reason there hasn't been another book since Villains is twofold. The first was, like I said, when this book first came out, it did not do well. And my publisher kind of gave me a big shrug, and I wrote a couple of books that they were not interested in. They were like, yep, sorry, sales numbers just aren't there. So then I got sucked into the quicksand of a PhD, and it is very, very difficult to write a dissertation and a novel at the same time. Trust me, I tried. But now that I am done with that and I am officially graduating on May 24th, and I will be leaving academia, thank God. I will be leaving academia, and I am working on the next thing because my agent is like, where is the next book? So I am working on that, and I'm sitting on about 35,000 words of something, and working on it as fast as I can. No official news on that yet. I have to actually finish the book first before we know if anything's going to happen with it. But we've talked a little bit about one of my other occupations is I do a lot of music writing, and I also do a lot of traveling. I'm on the road constantly. I spend so much time in my car with my dog. So I have always kind of wanted to write a road trip novel. That's been living somewhere deep down in here for a very long time. So that's kind of what I'm working on now. It's about travel. It's about music. It's about spending a lot of time in diners at 2 o'clock in the morning. Because that's another thing that I know and that I am really looking forward to exploring in fiction.
Very American.
Yes,
if I'm allowed to say that. Amazing. Yeah, sign me up for that one if it ends up being a travel or road trip novel.
Yeah.
Really love one of those.
Yeah.
Okay, so questions from the chat. What would you recommend to read next if I loved your book, besides Shakespeare and until you release a new one?
Well, so this might be a good circle back to the conversation about early campus novels that kind of get overlooked. One of the ones I would send you to, because this is such a great novel and I loved it so much, and I also found it really frustrating, but I was still like thinking about it like 4 days after I'd read it, which to me is always the sign of a good book, is Eleanor Catton, who wrote The Luminaries. She won a Booker Prize for The Luminaries. Her first novel, no one ever reads, and I don't know why, because it's great. It's called The Rehearsal. And if you like campus novels with kind of really interesting, morally gray characters, and if you also are interested in performance and music, The Rehearsal is a really great read. And it's short.
I wasn't even aware that she wrote another book before The Luminaries.
I know, nobody is, and I don't know why, because I will be championing that book forever.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
All right, another question from Miruna. I am so happy to be here with you. There is a question that persists in my mind. Although it might be a basic question, I have to ask, is there a character you felt closer to in a special way? I mean, do you feel that there is any character that you resemble?
That's another question I get pretty frequently. And what I usually tell people is, give me 30 years and I'll be Gwendolyn. Give me some time and I'll be Gwendolyn. Really looking forward to that. Yeah, what my agent always says, and I really quite like this, is she says that all of these characters are little bits and pieces of me, even the ones that you really don't like, because we're all complicated, multifaceted people. We all have little bits of Richard buried down in there. In terms of like the characters who are most like me, I'm not, none of these characters are an avatar for me any more than they're avatars for my friends. As an actor, I was very much a Philippa in the sense of I got cast in a lot of kind of weird secondary parts. I played a lot of men. I was in drag all the time. When I was in college, I went 3 straight years without playing a woman on stage. And then I finally got to play Titania. in A Midsummer Night's Dream. One of my friends said to me once, she said, "You're the only actor I know who could play Titania and Richard III in the same year," which I did. So I was very much in that kind of like, you have to be sort of a shapeshifter kind of a role. But yeah, you know, what I would say is I think I've been all of these people at different points in my life.
I'm still laughing about the Gwendolyn comment. I'm sorry. Right. So question from Instagram. What are some of your all-time favorite books?
Oh, that's like asking somebody to pick their favorite child. That's hard. You know, my favorite books change constantly. I have books that I'm obsessed with for a while, and then I find a different book that I fall in love with. I do generally, I really love Jennifer Egan's books. I'm reading Candy House right now, although one of my favorite books of Jennifer Egan's is actually The Keep, which takes place in Eastern Europe, and I read it. I don't know if you all know this. I actually spent a bunch of months in Romania when I was about 19. When I was about 19, I spent like 9 weeks in Romania, and it was amazing. I loved it. It was tremendous.
Come again? What?
Yeah.
Nobody was aware of that. Was anyone aware of that?
Oh, really?
No. Did you guys?
Oh. Yeah, I spent like a whole summer and a half in Romania when I was in college and loved it. I had a wonderful time. I did a lot of travel while I was there because I wanted to see as much of the country as possible. We were mostly in Deva, but you know, went to Bucharest and Sighișoara and Cluj and all kinds of different places. It was so great. I loved it there. It was wonderful. I would love to come back. But one of the reasons I liked The Keep so much as my dark horse favorite of Jennifer Egan's novels is because so much of it takes place in Eastern Europe, and I feel like she captured parts of it really well. It's also a very weird novel. I've mentioned Kurt Vonnegut. I do love Kurt Vonnegut. I have yet to read a Vonnegut book that I didn't like. My favorite is probably Breakfast of Champions. What else? Gosh, that's hard. Oh, I just read May Sarton's book, Journal of a Solitude, which is really beautiful. You wouldn't think that somebody could write so gorgeously about basically just being home alone, but it's really delicious. Yeah, I could list books that I love for days. And you'll often see me posting about books that I'm reading on Instagram. So if you're following me there, that stuff will come up a lot.
I was just gonna mention that, and as I was thinking, okay, maybe let's just put here in the chat a couple of your recs, but then now just follow her. You'll get more followers, and then we'll got info directly, so it's easier like that.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Still digesting the Romania information, though. Anyway, I'm gonna get over it soon. Question from the chat from Anna Maria. I was rereading the book a while back and got to think about the tower that James and Oliver live in. So I wanted to ask if it relates to the tower card in tarot and whether that was intentional in that it symbolizes the destruction of their relationship and the tragedy of James's action as well as Oliver's.
Oh, as an avid tarot reader, because tarot is a very early modern thing, and I work on a lot of early modern, like history of science, and early science is basically magic, so tarot is very relevant to all of that. I did not consciously write that with the tower in mind. The castle is actually based on, and you can Google this, it's really fun. On my undergrad campus, there is a crazy little building called Gimghoul Castle, which is such a great name. It's called Gimghoul Castle, and it is owned by a secret society. No one can go in there unless you're a member of the society, and they have all these crazy no trespassing signs, and if you get too close to it, you will get chased off the property. But it is literally like a little castle that is just built in the woods behind the theater building. So that was what the castle was based on, but I love that interpretation of the tower. I think that's perfectly valid. Yeah. I would love to do a villain's tarot deck. That would be so fun. Maybe that'll be my next creative project.
There you go. Find some artist, do the job. I was just gonna mention, what was the name of that book? I have to remember, because you mentioned tarot as being an early medieval thing, and that was like this book about it. But I have to anyway. Let's go back to the questions, and then if I remember, I'll just put it in the chat. We have 2 live questions left. There's Annalena, and then it's Irina. Girls, are you with us? I'm not gonna sing.
Okay,
good.
I'm here.
We can hear you, Irina. You can ask.
Okay. So first, I'm very thrilled to be here and meet you. And I wanted to ask, how did you manage to keep your social life together and work and all, and write a book at 22 years old?
Oh man. It was not easy, but I think because I started writing so young, it not quickly, but it became just sort of kind of an almost compulsive part of my day. I am sort of a demented insomniac. I have always struggled to sleep. It's just something I've never been good at. You wouldn't think you could be bad at sleeping, but I am terrible at it. So I did a lot of writing just kind of like in the wee hours, very late at night. So it was the sort of thing where when I was in college, it was kind of like I'd be sleeping until 11 o'clock, going to class at noon, being in class from noon to like 5, and then pretty much going straight to rehearsal pretty much every night at about 6 p.m. And then being in rehearsal from 6 to about 11, and then coming home, eating spinach out of the bag and drinking half a cup of coffee, and then sitting in my room and working on whatever I was writing. And it was a balancing act, but I don't sleep a lot, and I have the kind of brain where I really don't do well with unstructured time. I'm really bad at relaxing. And so writing kind of was like my safe space for where I needed to go when I needed time alone, and I was actually moving away from my social life and taking a break from rehearsal. Writing was a way to just kind of live in my own little world for a while, and I found that even though it is definitely work, and especially more so now that I'm juggling a bunch of different jobs, even though it is work, it felt restful and restorative to me. It was like a place where I could just sort of be in my own little world uninterrupted for a while. So it was a very cathartic thing in addition to being a creative outlet.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you for asking, Irina. One more call to Annalena, if she is with us.
Hello, everybody. Yes, I have two questions. One of it is there any chance for you to come back in Romania one day?
Oh, absolutely. I would love to. It's just a matter of like when and where and how, but yeah, I would absolutely love to come back to Romania. I had such a great time there, and I would love to come back when I'm not 19 and completely broken living out of a backpack, because that was hard. But I also didn't have a working cell phone. Like, this was long enough ago that smartphones were very new, and my phone did not work in Romania. So I was just kind of like stumbling around a foreign country with paper maps, and that was how I got around. And I learned a little bit of Romanian. Please don't ask me to say anything because I won't remember it. I think all I can still say is like, nu vorbesc bine românește, because I said that a lot. Which is just, I don't speak very good Romanian, which I don't. But I absolutely loved it there, and I would love to come back, you know, as a grown human.
We are happy to hear that. And the other question, what is the main lesson we can take from If We Were Villains? From your point of view?
You know, I think it's actually it's kind of in the title. It's that if. That if is so key to the title. It's not we were villains, it's if we were villains. It's conditional and uncertain. So much of this book is about gray areas and liminal spaces and things that are not black and white. And I think especially in fiction, we have a tendency to want a really clear moral narrative around things. And real life just is not like that. Real life just is not like that. Nothing is ideologically pure. Nothing is black and white, open and shut. And that's true of people. That's true of concepts. That's true of everything. And it's true of us as people too. Like, I'm hearing a lot of people talking about shadow selves now. It's become very big with like Instagram therapists. But your shadow self, the idea of the parts of you that you don't love and the parts of you that need work, but also being able to recognize that about yourself. Like, you know, I said something about I've been all of these characters, including Richard, including the ones that you don't like. And I think it's hard to really come to terms with who you are as a person if you're unable to kind of look that in the eye, unable to say, yeah, there are things about me that are terrible. I'm jealous, or I'm selfish, or I'm lazy, or whatever it is, insert 7 deadly sins here. I think that the sooner we come to terms with the idea that nothing is black and white, everything is a little bit gray, it makes life more challenging, but also more interesting. And I think we're better able to navigate it when we can kind of say to ourselves, 2 things can be true at once.
Yes, that is a very good answer, by the way. Like,
thank you.
It totally makes sense.
Thank you for the question. So guys, I have to warn you that we are already on borrowed time here. I know that we're all having a lot of fun and enjoying ourselves, but I'm just gonna, issue a final warning. I have one more question to take from the chat, and then maybe if you thought about something that you'd really like to ask or say to the lovely author, then I'm gonna take 3 more live questions. So prepare and raise your hands. Preferably using the app, so the emoticon, so that I can see you easily, and then I will take them from you and ask you to please voice them yourselves. So the question that I still have on the chat is coming from YouTube, and it says, when did you decide that the main character would have a male romantic interest, and will there be a sequel?
Well, I can answer the second one first, which is nope, no sequels. I always intended this book to end the way that it does, and I think that a sequel would kind of negate the impact of that ending, which is not what I wanted. And like I said, I could not have written this book now, and I don't think that 31-year-old me could write a sequel to this book. I always intended it to be a standalone, and I like it the way it is. So, and I'm also, as an artist, interested in moving on to write about other things. So I love it for what it is, and I want to leave it there. So no sequels. And what was the first question? Sorry, I've forgotten.
It was, when did you decide that the main character would have a male romantic interest?
Yeah, that was another thing that I knew from the very beginning. And that was partly came from my frustration with the lack of representation of queer people in campus novels and literature kind of writ large. I identify as a queer person, and that was a thing that, like, I was really tired of reading books where I did not say myself. The reason that they're both men, however, that has a lot to do actually with Shakespeare and with early modern history. In the early modern period, we didn't have a discrete gender binary the way we have now. That's a very modern invention that really starts with the Victorians, the idea of homo and heterosexual. What you did have in the early modern period is what we call a homosocial environment, which is an environment that is almost entirely one gender. And in the case of early modern theater, it would have been entirely men, because it was actually illegal for women to perform on stage up until like the 1700s in England. So all of the roles in Shakespeare's plays would have been played by men. The women would have been played by teenage boys. And in the early modern period, there is this really interesting kind of, speaking of gray areas, murky negotiation of gender identity, where there are very intimate friendships between men that often kind of cross this line into the romantic. And that was something that I wanted to explore in the text, because it's such a major theme in Shakespeare's plays and in early modern history. And the other part of it is, a lot of this book is about that conflict, that kind of hyper-masculinized conflict, and the sort of competition that happens between men, which is partly drawn from early modern theater and partly drawn from academic environments. And I think it's part of the reason we see a lot of campus novels that are populated almost exclusively by men. And I wanted to kind of do that differently and say, what if there is competition and violence here, but there is tenderness too? That's much more interesting, and I think much more true to life. So that's where that came in. And there were a lot of reasons for it, but those are a couple of the big ones.
Amazing. Thank you so much for saying that. I also left some recs in the chat room. So the one about the tarot that I promised to you, and the film on this thing about females not being able to perform on stage up to a set period during Shakespeare's time, and not only. Okay, so I have 2 people with their hands up at the moment. I said 3, so if there is somebody else who decides at the very last minute, please do. We'll start with Teodora and then Ilinca.
Okay, so you said at some point that you are a planner, and after rereading the book, I noticed a lot of foreshadowing for things that happen in the book, like the character that James plays in Macbeth, I think, that goes kind of crazy. So I was wondering, did you do that on purpose?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The roles that they play are very much kind of entwined with what happens in their personal lives, and that was very deliberate. And it's also why I chose those plays and why I changed the casting the way I did. Most of it's very intentional. However, there are, of course, things that are kind of accidental that I was like, I can just pretend that was intentional because it feels brilliant. So there are definitely little moments of foreshadowing that just sort of happened organically, but on the kind of large scale of it, yeah, there's an intelligent design there for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Ilinca, I think you're going to be the last person who asks a question, so make sure it's a good one. No pressure.
So I hope this doesn't sound stupid or anything, but because you did write Oliver as a queer person and because you do openly identify yourself as queer, do you face any struggles with like publishing or other authors or nominations for your book?
That's a great question. And it's hard to answer because I don't always know if I'm being discriminated against because of that. We positioned this book very deliberately, though, when it was coming out. We didn't advertise it as an LGBTQ book. And that wasn't because I didn't want to be associated with LGBTQ books, because I am so happy to be associated with that. And I love that so many LGBTQ people have seen themselves in this book. But we didn't make that part of our marketing. And the reason was I did not want readers to get to decide if they wanted to read about queer people or not, because you don't get to decide if queer people exist in the world. So in your fiction, it should be the same way. They're just part of the landscape. They're just there. So that was deliberate. And I have had some people who have been really upset about that and really offended by it. And also some people who have been really pleasantly surprised by it. And I've also had people tell me, wow, this really changed my mind about same-sex relationships and what that might look like. So that was kind of intentional that we didn't advertise it as LGBTQ fiction, because LGBTQ fiction is for everyone. So that was intentional. And fortunately, publishing, at least in the States, I can't speak to other countries. We actually have had some issues with publishers changing the content of the book without telling us in other languages and taking queer content out. We had to threaten to sue a couple of publishers over that happening. So that has happened. Yeah. As for discrimination that I face personally, I'm fortunate in that I work in very progressive industries. Theater tends to attract, as somebody else mentioned, I think it might have been you, Iulia, theater tends to attract people who don't always fit with the mainstream. And that happens with the arts often. You have a lot of creative people who don't like being bound by rigid social expectations. So, and academia is very much the same way. Academia is very forward thinking, especially in the humanities. So I am fortunate in that, the fields I work in tend to be very progressive, but I've also deliberately sought out fields that are very progressive because it would be hard for me to be surrounded by a hostile environment, basically. So yeah, I think anybody who is existing as a queer person in the world you're gonna run into discrimination, sometimes from the people who are closest to you, and that's really hard. Sometimes from institutions that are supposed to keep you safe, and that's really hard. I have been very lucky in that the fields that I work in, publishing and academia, and also music to a certain extent, tend to be very welcoming of queer people. So that's lucky for me, and I know that's not true everywhere.
Thank you so much for this, and Ilinca, thank you so much for the question. I think you actually did quite well. Congrats. It was a very good question to end this with. But because I'm very mean, I will actually add very, very, very quickly 3 flash questions of mine because they've been nagging at me ever since I started this Q&A. So first of all, least favorite Shakespeare play.
Oh, this is going to make me so unpopular, but I'm going to say it anyway. And this may be temporary. Like I said, my favorites change. If I never have to read Hamlet again, it'll be too soon. Like, you cannot write a dissertation about madness in early modern drama and not write about Hamlet. Trust me, I tried, and my director was like, no, you can't do that. It's just so overdone. I think we need like a 10-year embargo on Hamlet. Like, just don't do it and read some of the other plays for a while.
Amazing.
Hopefully that doesn't get me canceled, but yeah, maybe no Hamlet for a couple of years.
Yeah, not for my part, for sure. Okay. Second question, all-time favorite Shakespeare character.
Oh, also hard. This is like asking me to pick favorite children.
I'm sorry. I told you I'm mean.
So, and again, this could change. Like, ask me again in 6 months and you get a different answer. But the character I return to most frequently, and I don't know if that makes him a favorite or maybe kind of a problematic fave, if we still say that, is Macbeth, actually. People always expect it to be Lady Macbeth, but it's actually Macbeth himself. And my longest and most difficult dissertation chapter was about Macbeth. It ended up being like 85 pages and it was like torturous to write. But, and I don't know what this says about me, but I identify very strongly with Macbeth in some of the situations that he finds himself in. And, you know, we talked about recognizing the parts of yourself that you don't like so much. But I also have a lot of deep sympathy for Macbeth that would be difficult to explain briefly. So Macbeth is definitely one. The other one who is always a favorite of mine is Regan from King Lear. I love her so much, and I think she's a deeply underrated character.
Amazing. Thank you for voicing that. Actually, coming from an expert, it sounds so much better. Okay, and for the last one, are you actually randomly quoting Shakespeare to your friends, like in normal situations? Like, does this actually happen? Is it a fact? Just asking.
So, yeah, there's 2 different reactions I tend to get to this book really broadly, and I can always tell if the person asking the question is a theater person or not, because one school of reaction is, this is so exaggerated, this is so overdramatic, nobody is like this, nobody is this melodramatic, this is so unbelievable. Those are people who did not do theater. And then I get people who are like, I was having war flashbacks to my conservatory program and I had to stop reading, and I'm like, you get it. So is this kind of a little bit exaggerated for the fictive medium? Of course, but I will say that when I went off to London to do my master's degree in Shakespeare, you know, fortunately it never escalated to murder, but our friend group was very much like this. We had a small, close-knit group of people who were in this very competitive, culty, insular academic environment, and trauma bonding is real. There's about 5 of us who are still very close friends. They're some of my best friends in the world. And we did, and we do quote random lines of Shakespeare at each other, just because when you're so immersed in that for so long, that stuff lives in my head rent free. And it just, sometimes that's the easiest way to say something. So yeah, it is a real thing. It is a real thing that happens with certain groups of people. And also I would say actors who are working on a show. Actors who are working on a show together will absolutely kind of speak in a weird pidgin English that's half references to whatever play they're working on. So, yeah.
That's a good thing, actually. I was just thinking that I can confuse a lot of people if I just reply to them using Shakespeare lines.
Oh, yeah. That's a great thing to have in your back pocket.
I mean, imagine, especially when you have a deadline or something like that, and people are like emailing you and you send back Shakespeare lines.
Yes, I actually have a Shakespeare footer in my email.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Do share some knowledge. That's a point. I mean, if you have like a special course to reply a certain, email, then yeah, you're going to use that. Thank you. Okay, guys. So glad to have served as your chief entertainer tonight. Very humbly thanking M.L.Rio for the lovely performance that she delivered for us, and for her candor and for her honesty and for everything that she told us that was so amazing and unexpected. And I'm sure that nobody was actually betting on how this QA was going to unfold. So thank you very much, ML. Thank you very much to everybody who had the courage to voice their questions. And thank you very much to all of you who were here but could not or would not voice their questions. I'm sure that you have so much love in your heart and so much imagination in your minds. And I'm sure that there's going to be lots of opportunities for you guys to voice everything you have in mind. And I would love to end this, if possible, not with a Shakespeare quote, but I don't know, ML, if you have anything to say to your readers in Romania, that I think would be a very lovely way to end this evening.
Yeah, I just want to thank you all so much for being here and for asking really great questions. You know, I can't give you a good answer to questions that don't give me an opportunity for that. And you've asked such deep, wonderful, intelligent questions. And I'm just honored that so many people have found this book and loved this book. And I hope that it continues to bring you joy if it's brought you joy, or bring you angst if it's brought you angst and you kind of enjoy that in a weird masochistic way. And I really hope that I will be able to come to Romania in person again sometime soon, and maybe we'll do a live Q&A. That'd be great.
It can be arranged, I'm
All right.
sure.
Yes, let's make that happen somehow.
Absolutely. Okay, guys, thank you very much to everybody. Thank you, Cărturești. Thank you, Alice Books. Thank you, FestivalYA. Thank you, participants. Thank you, Mom. Thank you, Dad. I know you're not watching, but thank you, M.L.Rio, because you were the best. Goodbye, guys.
And thank
Have
you,
a lovely
Iulia,
evening.
for running this whole thing.
Thank you.